Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Jakobi, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 4 hidden gems for the 2024 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, talking about players at a variety of different positions, players that you would consider to be sleeper options. I consider them to be my hidden gems based on everyone's favorite cinematic universe. These are players that, going into this upcoming week, either first and foremost aren't rostered in very many leagues or don't have a high start percentage. So I'll share with you guys my thought process and opinions while also providing statistics in order to justify why we might want to go ahead and start these players going into the given week. Okay, at the end of today's episode, I'll also be going ahead and putting together a couple pick'em slips via Underdog. Again, if you guys are interested, you can travel down to the description and check out the timestamps down there. While you're down there, if you have not yet already, head on over to Underdog. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to be able to claim the first-time deposit offer, but you'll get my rankings sent to you every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. These rankings are by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, all-encompassing rankings, including flex, in order to help you guys capture a 2024 fantasy football championship. All you got to make sure is you're eligible based on your location on the right side of the screen. Thank you very much for all the support. And if in fact you aren't eligible based on location or you've signed up with a code in the past, you can check out the Patreon. Thank you. Okay, so let's begin with the first hidden gem of the week. It is in fact Jakobi Meyers as our soul stone. As we talk about every single week, the soul stone requires a sacrifice of something that we love. And going into this week, I love the potential prospect of Davante Adams having himself a bounce back performance going up against the Cleveland Browns. Of course, 1 week after Malik Neighbors torched that defense and scored himself a touchdown, had himself over 70 receiving yards. So why not a guy like, Davante Adams in the same caliber of an elite wide receiver? So with Davante Adams already being designated out going into this game against the Cleveland Browns, we then position ourselves to pick up and play Jakobi Meyers. At this current moment in time on Yahoo Fantasy, he's currently only rostered in 37% of leagues and only being started in 9% of leagues. And the reason why we want to play him is because first and foremost, he's going to have a lot of opportunity in the absence of Davante Adams. Over the course of the last 2 seasons as a member of the Las Vegas Raiders, when Jakobi Meyers has been given ample opportunity of 7 or more targets in a singular game, he's had 8 of those different instances. In those games, averaging 15.76 half PPR fantasy points per game. In 7 of those 8 games where he's been given 7 or more targets, he's been able to put up a base minimum of 12 or more fantasy points. The level of production that we should see out of Jakobi Meyers going into this week should be extremely high. And that's where we're going to rank him going into Sunday morning's live stream. Again, be sure to swing on by from 7 to 10 a.m. I'll have up-to-date rankings on screen. But going into the week, I'm very confident, especially considering the Cleveland Browns secondary and defense hasn't been as great as they were at the beginning of the 2023 season. Over the course of the last 5 games, the Cleveland Browns defense has allowed the following statistics on a per game average to opposing wide receivers: 19 targets, 12 receptions, 144 receiving yards, and 1.2 receiving touchdowns per game. If we're going to be in line for Jakobi Meyers and Trey Tucker to be the primary wide receiver options of this offense going into the week, Jakobi Meyers is implicated for a lot of potential targets and, of course, fantasy points to follow. Last season, as a member of the Indianapolis Colts, Gardner Minshew took on the Cleveland Browns. And the reason why I bring this up is because he has a familiarity with taking on that defense, in the same vein in which he had a familiarity taking on the Baltimore Ravens last season and was able to already beat them this season. That's 2 years in a row in which Gardner Minshew has been able to defeat the Baltimore Ravens regardless of what team he has been on. Either way, last season, Gardner Minshew with the Colts, taking on the Cleveland Browns, threw for 305 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and the Colts lost 38-39. I think the Raiders are in a great position for a bounce-back performance, and of course, leading the way is going to be Jakobi Meyers. Moving on to our next hidden gem, we have Michael Wilson. He is the reality stone of the week because the reality of the situation is he's currently only rostered in 13% of leagues and currently only being started in 4% of leagues, despite the fact that Trey McBride, the starting tight end of the Arizona Cardinals, is absent and is going to be out due to the concussion protocol. And going into this week, we have an incredible matchup. And the reality of the situation is you always want to start your wide receivers against the Washington Commanders. That started as of last season and continues as of thus far this season. The Washington Commanders are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average, 44.73 on a per game basis. Thus far this season, they have allowed receiving touchdowns for Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Jalen McMillan, Neighbors, Wan'Dale Robinson, Jamar Chase, Andre Yoshifas, all of those wide receivers finding an abundance of success. So why not Michael Wilson? Sure, Marvin Harrison Jr. on the opposite side of the field is going to find his own success, but considering what Michael Wilson produced last week against the Detroit Lions, putting up a career high in terms of total targets and receptions, 9 targets, 8 receptions, while also playing 90% of the offensive snaps last week, it builds even more confidence in terms of potentially starting him going up against the best matchup at the position. Over the course of the last 2 seasons of Michael Wilson's career, in games in which he has been given 6 or more targets, he's averaging 12.03 fantasy points per game. We're going to be in a position in which, in the absence of Trey McBride, we're going to ask a lot out of Michael Wilson, and he's going to be able to deliver against the Washington Commanders secondary. Now, again, this could very easily be a game in which it's all Marvin Harrison or far more Greg Dortch than we potentially anticipate. But the fact of the matter is, Michael Wilson is on the field 90+% of the time. Getting himself a high volume of targets is not going to be out of the realm of possibility, especially going up against that secondary. It should be an easy task on hand, especially considering, the Bengals just on Monday night going up against the Washington Commanders, they didn't punt a single time in that game. This is implicated to be the highest scoring matchup of the week, and hopefully Michael Wilson's able to, of course, step up to the task on hand. Moving on to our next hidden gem, we have ROSCHON Johnson. Based on the overall contributions as of late from the efforts of Khalil Herbert and DeAndre Swift, ROSCHON Johnson has been elevated and is now in the conversation of potentially winning this running back job. A running back who is currently only rostered in 22% of leagues and currently only being started in 2% of leagues going into this week. The reason why ROSCHON Johnson was even activated last week was because Travis Homer was sent to the injured reserve. And in Travis Homer's overall absence, we still had the lackluster performances of Khalil Herbert and DeAndre Swift continuing. Thus far this season, Swift averaging 1.84 yards per carry, while Khalil Herbert is averaging 2.0 yards per carry. And in his first overall week as a participating member of the offense, ROSCHON Johnson stepped up. In last week's game, was able to get himself a total of 12 total touches, 13 opportunities for 8.2 fantasy points. Those touches came in the form of 8 rushing attempts for 30 rushing yards, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 32 receiving yards. When they feel so confident, or when the coaching staff feels so adamant about getting another running back in the mix, considering the lack of production from the other running backs in this overall conversation, of course, it grants ROSCHON Johnson the opportunity taking on the Los Angeles Rams. It's the 4th best matchup at the position. In terms of running back rushing statistics isolated thus far this season, the Rams are allowing 19.5 fantasy points per game just off of rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. Thus far this season, Detroit in week 1, 131 and 2 touchdowns from their running backs. Arizona, 178 and 1 touchdown. And San Francisco, 96 rushing yards last week. When I've looked at the history of Shane Waldron, the current offensive coordinator of the Chicago Bears, when he was with the Seattle Seahawks and took on the Los Angeles Rams multiple times a year. Specifically in 2023, the Seattle Seahawks ran the ball with their running back 17 and 20 times in the 2 games in which they took on the Rams. We're going to be in a similar position in which, of course, ROSCHON Johnson should be given ample opportunity. Over the course of ROSCHON Johnson's short career, in games in which he's been given 10 or more touches, he's averaging 10.12 fantasy points per game, and we're hoping for continued success, and of course for him to supplant and potentially Wally Pip DeAndre Swift going forward. The power stone of the week is typically a running back and a power back of sorts, and even though there aren't very many power backs out there that I trust, I do like the overall upside and potential of ROSCHON Johnson. At very least, make sure you pick him up and have him on roster. You don't have to start him this week, but as long as you have him on roster, there's a clear chance in which he could win this running back backfield. I mentioned this a couple days ago in terms of a live stream. Very similar to last season, in which Miles Sanders went from being a Philadelphia Eagle averaging over 5 yards per carry, then going to the Carolina Panthers and eventually losing his job to Chuba Hubbard. We have the same situation of DeAndre Swift going from being an Eagles running back averaging over 5 yards per carry, then joining the Chicago Bears and eventually losing his job to ROSCHON Johnson. That's what we're anticipating to see, and that's why we have ROSCHON Johnson as this week's Power Stone. Moving on to the Space Stone, we have XAVIER LEGETTE. The reason why I have wide receivers as our space stone every single week, because it's a player who has potential to shoot for the moon and fall amongst the stars. And in this overall situation, we have XAVIER LEGETTE, currently only rostered in 13% of leagues, which needs to be bumped up, and only being started in 2% of leagues, which again, you don't have to start him this week, but hear me out. Over the course of this season, there have only been 2 quarterbacks thus far this year that have had over 300 passing yards and 3 passing touchdowns in a singular game. The first person to accomplish that in 2024 was Andy Dalton. In that game last week, in which he had a winning effort, still threw the ball 37 times in the game overall. Imagine if they're down in the game and they have to throw the ball 50 times in order to keep up with the Cincinnati Bengals offense. Imagine if that's a potential reality. If in fact it is, XAVIER LEGETTE should be in line for a huge overall week, especially considering Adam Thielen went to the injured reserve. Not only that, Jonathan Mingo is a wide receiver that, even though he has gotten playing time, isn't as good as XAVIER LEGETTE. And once given the opportunity, XAVIER LEGETTE will easily be able to jump over him and get far more target opportunity within this offense. We already know that Deontay Johnson is dealing with a little bit of a groin injury. I think he'll probably get cleared in terms of his overall practice later on today, so that we won't have to worry about that. But it will be the XAVIER LEGETTE Deontay Johnson show in regards to the receiving game here, especially when you're taking on the Bengals, who over the course of this season are allowing 25.13 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers on average in terms of receiving statistics isolated. For a wide receiver like XAVIER LEGETTE, who can very easily take a top off of the defense, why not go ahead and fire him up against an advantageous matchup that could be a very high scoring game where Andy Dalton is taking on his former team. We always like these revenge games. Thus far this season, if we exclude week 1, taking on the Patriots, because obviously Patriots wide receivers are non-existent, thus far this season, on a per-game average, the Bengals are allowing, as of the last 2 weeks, 13 targets, 10.5 receptions, 152 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns per game to opposing wide receivers. If we're aligned for Deontay Johnson to have a big week, why not Xavier Legette? Especially considering Xavier Legette last week lined up in the slot position on 42% of the overall snaps that he played. If he's going to be taking over that slot receiving role, he'll have even more of an opportunity to step up with the task on hand in the absence of Adam Thielen. Moving on to the time stone, it's finally time for another wide receiver and player to return to our lineups. Last week we had Jake Ferguson as the time stone coming back from his injury, and now we have Jordan Addison, a player that is currently rostered in 73% of leagues, which again should have already been rostered in on your injured reserve spot. And now that he's available, currently only being started in 13% of leagues, which in my opinion should be a little bit higher, especially considering how well the Minnesota Vikings have played as of late. So now that Jordan Addison has been cleared from the injury report and that he's ready to go and he's ready to make his return, if we travel back to week 1, in that overall circumstance, he played 51% of the overall snaps and quite literally was able to accumulate 4 targets, 3 receptions, 35 receiving yards in just the first half of football. If you're able to give him a full reign of exposure throughout an entire game against the Green Bay Packers, in which it could very easily be a high-scoring matchup, we're talking about Jordan Addison having the potential of putting up numbers in which he did last season. If we go back to the Minnesota Vikings taking on the Green Bay Packers with Kirk Cousins last season, 8 targets, 7 receptions, 82 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown for Jordan Addison. In the game in which he had Nick Mullins or Jaron Hall last season against the Green Bay Packers, only 5 targets, 3 receptions for 28 receiving yards. But I'm leaning in the direction of Sam Darnold being far more like the potential upside of Kirk Cousins rather than what Nick Mullins and Jaron Hall were producing for this offense this time last year. So in this overall scenario, considering Sam Darnold's coming off of the best week of his entire career, 4 passing touchdowns, a 79.2% passing completion percentage, and a victory in an incredible fashion against the Houston Texans defense, the expectation is that Jordan Addison should step up and, of course, find himself in abundance of opportunity. In his absence, Jalen Naylor has scored a touchdown in each of the last 3 games. If we're going to be in a situation in which, of course, Jordan Addison is the number 2 on the field for the majority of the time, he could be implicated in scoring a touchdown within the upcoming matchup against a division rival. Moving on to the final player I wanted to mention is Tyler Conklin. Tyler Conklin, as of thus far this season, currently only rostered in 32% of leagues, but for those of you who are desperate with tight end injuries, you've picked him up, and he's currently only being started in 15% of leagues going into the given week. But cursed with knowledge and with the Mind Stone, the fact of the matter is, Tyler Conklin never leaves the field. And as the season progresses, he's only going to get more and more opportunity. Over the course of this season thus far, he's played 90+% of the overall snaps every single game. He's coming off of a week in week 3, which was 10 days prior to this next game, which they should be rested for, in which he got himself 6 targets, 5 receptions, 93 receiving yards, and 11.8 fantasy points. Now has an opportunity of taking on the Denver Broncos, who is allowing 11.2 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, just off of receiving statistics isolated based on weeks 2 and 3. These overall contributions have come in from the Steelers tight ends, 5 targets, 5 receptions, 44 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. And the Buccaneers tight ends, about 90% of these statistics belonging to Cade Otton. And imagine, Cade Otton doesn't do anything throughout the season. But when he has a productive week against the defense, you know that the tight end position is going to be able to feast against them in future weeks. The Buccaneers in week 3, 9 targets, 8 receptions, 55 receiving yards from their Titans. Again, a lot of that from Cade Otton. So why not a player like Tyler Conklin? In a matchup in which, of course, we have Nathaniel Hackett taking on his former team. Of course, he was the former head coach of that organization, was replaced. Sean Payton has talked his stuff. There's definitely beef between the two, and it's going to continue to be settled every time they take each other on. Last season, in the matchup, of course, the Jets were the victorious of the two. In that overall game, the Jets had targeted their tight ends 8 times for 7 receptions, 81 receiving yards, and 11.6 fantasy points. So why not for Tyler Conklin? Another incredible week going into the overall matchup in which, of course, Garrett Wilson could very easily be shut down by the potential of this secondary and Patrick Surtain. If Lazard isn't able to find himself success, of course, the running game is going to be able to function, but with the running game, Tyler Conklin over the middle, definitely a huge factor within this offense. All right, that's going to cover my hidden gems for week 4. Let's go ahead and let's now transition into talking about some underdog potential pick'em plays in which I'm picking higher or lower on given statistics, and of course, putting together a couple pick'em slips as of late. So, as of right now, one of my favorite slips that I put together is the following. Now, because I put Marvin Harrison on going higher than 13.5 fantasy points, it limited my overall entry to 500. So I've gone ahead and put together 2 $500 entries, continuing my 3-week streak of putting together $1,000 entries every single week. So as of right now, Marvin Harrison over 13.5 receiving yards. Again, like we mentioned earlier, The Washington Commanders are allowing 44 plus fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. With Trey McBride absent and Marvin Harrison scoring a touchdown in each of the last 2 games and balling out on a consistent basis, he is implicated for at least a 15-point game in a half PPR scoring format. There's a reason why I have him as a top 10 ranked wide receiver going into the week, and he was my thumbnail for my wide receiver episode. Now we have Breece Hall, who again takes on the Denver Broncos. He has his own revenge game against this team. Going back to 2022, tore his ACL against the Denver Broncos despite having an incredible performance prior to that injury. Last season, his breakout game of the year was in Week 5 after they let him loose. They let him loose against the Denver Broncos, where he ran all over that defense and is once again going to have an opportunity of doing so. It's one of the more advantageous matchups, and considering he still has vulture protection in case any other non-running back steals a touchdown, it's a great overall play considering he has scored a touchdown each of the last 2 weeks and is averaging 21 touches per game despite the overall presence of Braylon Allen as of late. Then the final play is Brian Robinson Jr. In the absence of Austin Eckler, there isn't as much of a vulture kind of threat in comparison to Breece Hall having Braylon Allen as Brian Robinson has with Jaden Daniels. If in fact we're in a situation in which Brian Robinson is given the opportunity and scores a rushing touchdown, beautiful. He's been able to accomplish that twice already thus far this season, but there's also been situations in which, of course, Jaden Daniels steals those rushing touchdowns on the goal line. If it takes place, well, guess what? You get your money back. And that is why we go ahead and we kind of bank on the vulture protection within the overall play. 500 to go ahead and 5 times your money for 2670, a pretty good overall play within the given week. Then we move on to the second play that I really like. Another play in which we're 4xing our overall entry with $500. We like Travis Kelce going higher than 46.5 receiving yards. In 5 of the last 6 games in which he's been able to take on the Los Angeles Chargers defense, he's been able to surpass over 100 receiving yards. Not only that, Derwin James is suspended. And when you have Travis Kelce and Jason Kelce on their podcast, and Jason Kelce's crying about the fact that his brother's not getting the ball. And obviously as a brother, it's heartfelt. I respect it. But when we have that kind of emotion regarding Travis Kelce not getting the ball, this team's going to get him the ball. And I can assure you, especially against the Los Angeles Chargers, they're going to be able to find a lot of success with Travis Kelce. It's not going to be just the Rashee Rice show going into the week. George Pickens at 49.5 receiving yards. Again, when you're taking on the Indianapolis Colts, anything is possible. Whether you want to take higher on Freiermuth receptions, whether you want to take higher on Najee Harris rushing yards, whether you want to take higher on anytime touchdowns for Justin Fields, it doesn't matter. I think that this Indianapolis Colts defense cannot stop a soul. And George Pickens, as the primary number 1, should find himself in abundance of success within the matchup, especially considering all of the wide receivers that have found their overall success within the week. You know, it's funny. I screenshotted this. I could have canceled it. I didn't. And you'll see that when we get to, of course, the upcoming live streams. But either way, that's a great overall play. Followed up with Nico Collins, 59.5 receiving yards. I found that number of 59.5 receiving yards on my phone. If you log into your Underdog app on your phone, iOS device, etc. If you go and you change the number after you go to a player, you can click on the overall statistic. Instead of picking higher or lower, you can pick on like the little arrow key and you can pick different numbers and different spreads. His number currently is 81.5. I got it at 59.5, which you can very easily do so. And that's an automatic considering in 5 of the last 6 games he has played, he has surpassed 85 or more receiving yards, and there's no Tank Dell. This should be an automatic week here for Nico Collins. All right, that's going to cover it in regards to my potential pick'em plays and my hidden gems for week 4 of the 2024 fantasy football season. I want to thank you all for watching again later tonight. I'll be live streaming tomorrow afternoon, Saturday, 1 to 3 p.m., Sunday morning, 7 to 10 a.m. Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you haven't yet already, again, be sure to check out Underdog, link down in the description. But if you guys want my all-encompassing rankings besides Underdog, you can find that via Patreon. One of the most valuable prospects of that overall Patreon membership is asking me unlimited questions. So for those of you interested, again, you don't have to wait for a live stream. You can ask me at any time of the day, and I try to answer as quickly as I possibly can. Check that out today. Link down in the description. All right, guys. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.